It was late October 2018 when I decided to take a camping trip with my dog, Cody. I was 28 then, living in a small town outside of Grand Junction, Colorado. Life had been kind of heavy that year. Work was dragging me down, bills piling up, and I just needed to breathe somewhere away from everything. I thought maybe a few days out in the woods would help reset my mind. No phones, no people, just me, Cody, and the sound of trees moving in the breeze. I picked a spot up in the Grand Mesa National Forest, a few hours' drive from town. It was remote but still close enough that if something went wrong, I could hike back to my truck in half a day. I packed light, my old green tent, a heavy-duty sleeping bag, a few cans of soup, some jerky, basic cooking gear, a hunting knife, a flashlight, a hatchet, and some bottled water. I packed a few extra things for Cody too: kibble, a collapsible bowl, and his thick orange collar with the reflective strip. Cody was a big dog, a German Shepherd mixed with maybe some lab, and he never strayed far from me. We left early on a Friday morning. The drive up was beautiful, the trees fiery with fall colors, golds and deep reds. The sun cut through the thin clouds, lighting up the mountains in the distance. Cody stuck his head out the window most of the way, tongue lolling, eyes squinting into the cold air. By noon, we reached the rough dirt road leading to the trailhead. I parked at a wide shoulder where the ground was flat enough, slung my backpack on, clicked Cody's leash, and started hiking. The trail climbed steeply at first, switchbacking up a rocky slope scattered with pine needles. After about an hour, it leveled out into dense forest. The trees here were thick, mostly pines and firs, and the ground was soft with fallen needles. I could tell right away nobody had been through there for a while. No fresh boot prints, no broken branches. It was quiet, just the faint crunch of my boots and Cody's soft panting. I planned to set up camp near a small alpine lake I had seen on the map. It wasn't an official campsite, more like a hidden gem you only found if you knew where to look. It took another 2 hours of steady hiking before we reached it. The lake was perfect, ringed by tall trees, the water dark and still, the surface broken only by the occasional ripple from a falling pine needle. I could smell the sharp, clean scent of the forest, mixed with the rich, damp smell of the earth. I picked a spot about 30 yards from the water's edge, where the trees opened up enough to let in some light but still offered some protection from wind. I unrolled the tent and got to work. Cody nosed around the site, sniffing everything with interest but never wandering too far. By the time I finished setting up, the sun was dipping low, casting the sky in shades of pink and orange. I built a small fire in a ring of rocks, fed Cody, and heated up a can of stew for myself. I ate sitting on a flat rock, my back against a tree, feeling more relaxed than I had in months. Cody curled up next to me, his body warm against the chilly air. As night fell, the forest came alive with small sounds, twigs snapping, distant rustles. I wasn't worried. Animals move around at night. Deer, raccoons, squirrels. I tossed some more wood onto the fire, watching the flames leap and dance. When I finally climbed into the tent, Cody followed, circling twice before settling at my feet. I zipped up the door and let the fire burn down outside, the soft orange glow flickering against the tent walls. I slept hard for a few hours but woke up sometime deep in the night. It was cold, the kind of cold that bites at your nose and ears. I listened for a while, hearing nothing but the wind sighing through the trees. Cody lifted his head, ears perked, but after a minute he settled back down. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around my shoulders and drifted back to sleep. The next morning was clear but colder than I expected. My breath came out in white puffs as I broke down camp and packed up for a day hike. I wasn't planning to move sites, just wanted to explore a little around the lake. I stuffed a day pack with water, a few snacks, and my knife, and set out with Cody trotting ahead, tail wagging. We hiked for a few hours, moving slowly, following game trails and weaving between the trees. Around mid-morning, we stumbled across something odd. At first, it looked like a pile of old clothes dumped against a fallen log. As I got closer, I realized it was a deer carcass, or what was left of one. It had been picked clean, bones stripped of meat, but not by natural decay. It looked too fresh for that. Flies buzzed thick around it, Some of the bones had deep grooves and scratches, not the clean tear you'd expect from coyotes or scavengers. Cody growled low in his throat, the fur on his back standing up. I felt a prickle along my spine. Something about it wasn't right. I pulled him back and we skirted wide around it, moving quicker now. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was a mountain lion kill, or maybe scavengers had gotten sloppy. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out there. The day passed slow and uneasy after that. Every sound seemed louder. Every shadow looked deeper. Cody stayed closer to me, no longer bounding ahead but keeping pace right at my side. I checked my watch constantly, counting down the hours until I could retreat to the safety of the tent. We made it back to camp by late afternoon. I built the fire higher than before, fed Cody, and tried to act normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing into the trees, half expecting to see eyes staring back. That night was worse. The wind picked up after dark, hissing through the pines. The fire guttered and flared. Cody stayed alert, ears twitching at every sound. Sometime after midnight, he stood up stiffly, growling deep in his chest. I sat up, heart hammering, straining to listen. At first, I heard nothing, just the wind. But then there it was, a soft crunch, then another. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving around the edge of our campsite. Cody barked once, sharp and loud, and I fumbled for my flashlight. I unzipped the tent just enough to shine the beam outside. The forest beyond the fire's glow was an endless wall of black. I didn't see anything, but I knew someone, or something, was out there. I stayed awake the rest of the night, knife in hand, flashlight on my lap. Cody never settled, pacing back and forth in the tent, occasionally growling at unseen things beyond the walls. Every time I started to doze off, a snap or rustle would jolt me awake. When the sky finally started to lighten, I packed up camp faster than I thought possible. My hands were clumsy from cold and lack of sleep, but I didn't care. I needed to get out of there. I clipped Cody's leash and started back down the trail toward the truck. The hike back was brutal. Every few hundred yards, I glanced behind us. Nothing, but the feeling of being followed never left. Cody stayed close, his head low, growling every so often. About halfway back, we came across another unsettling sign. This time it was a tree, a massive pine right next to the trail, with deep, fresh gouges clawed into the bark about 6 feet up. It didn't look like bear marks. Bears leave wide, raking scars. These were narrower, more controlled, like someone had hacked at it with a knife or axe. I didn't stop to examine it. I just kept moving. The trail twisted and dipped through thick undergrowth, and several times I thought I heard something crashing through the woods parallel to us, just out of sight. Every time I stopped, the sound stopped too. The final mile to the truck felt like the longest of my life. When I finally saw the shimmer of sunlight off the metal roof through the trees, I nearly cried from relief. I practically ran the last stretch, yanking the keys from my pocket, fumbling them into the lock. I threw the backpack in the bed, got Cody in the passenger seat, and jumped behind the wheel. I didn't even bother taking off my boots. I started the engine, threw it into reverse, and tore out of there, gravel spraying behind us. It wasn't until we were back on the main highway, miles away from the forest, that I started to breathe normally again. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something step out of the trees. When we got home, I spent an hour just sitting on the floor with Cody, scratching behind his ears, feeling his steady breathing. I don't know what was out there. Maybe it was a crazy hunter, maybe some drifter hiding out in the woods, maybe just my imagination fueled by too many nights alone. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to that lake. Not ever. I learned something out there. The wilderness doesn't care about you. It doesn't matter how prepared you think you are, how strong or smart you feel. Out there, you're just another animal, and sometimes you're not the top of the food chain. Cody stayed close to me for weeks afterward, always alert, always watching. He sensed it too, that whatever had stalked us out there wasn't something we could explain away with city logic. It's been years now, but sometimes, late at night when the wind rattles the windows just right, I can feel that old fear creeping back in. Not because I believe in ghosts or monsters, but because I know people, real people, can be. I had always liked being alone in places most people avoided. Maybe it was because the world felt less loud there. Maybe it was because I felt invisible in normal life and it made sense to hide somewhere nobody would ever look. I don't know. All I knew was that in early October 2016, when I was 26, I decided to spend a night camping in an abandoned graveyard way out past the old highway south of Greenvale, Tennessee. It wasn't a well-known graveyard. You couldn't even find it on Google Maps. I had heard about it from a guy I used to work with. He told me it was called New Hope Cemetery, even though there was nothing new about it. Most of the stones dated back to the late 1800s, and the newest graves were from the 1950s before the town dried up and everyone moved closer to the interstate. I figured it would be peaceful. Just me, my old canvas tent, a cooler full of beer, and the dry fall wind rattling through the dead leaves. I had no plans to do anything crazy. Just camp, maybe take a few photos, and head back to my apartment the next morning. I packed light, a basic sleeping bag, the tent, a headlamp, a small hatchet, a lighter, a flashlight, some instant noodles, and a couple of bottles of water. I also brought my old .22 pistol, not because I expected to need it, but because being alone in the middle of nowhere felt a little less crazy with something solid in my hand. The drive out there was longer than I remembered. The dirt roads had gotten worse, washed out and full of deep ruts from rain. My old Ford Ranger bounced hard as I crept along at 15 miles an hour. The sun was already low, throwing long shadows across the fields and into the thin woods that lined the road. I almost missed the turn. The old wooden sign for New Hope was half collapsed. The words so faded you could only read them if you already knew what it was supposed to say. I pulled the truck as far off the road as I could, grabbed my pack, and started walking. The graveyard was set back about a quarter mile from the road, through a tangle of overgrown brush and scrubby trees. It wasn't fenced, just a wide clearing filled with leaning, cracked tombstones, some no bigger than a loaf of bread, others tall and proud, covered in moss and lichen. The first thing I noticed was how still it was. No birds, no bugs, no distant hum of traffic, just the whisper of the wind sliding through the brittle grass. It wasn't scary. It wasn't anything. Just empty. I picked a spot near the middle, where a big live oak threw a crooked shadow over a cluster of headstones. The ground was mostly flat, though a little soft, and I stomped it down before setting up my tent. I worked fast, the way you do when the light's dropping and the cold is starting to creep in. By the time I got the tent up and my sleeping bag unrolled inside, the sky had gone full dark. The stars were sharp and close, and the moon was a pale smear behind thin clouds. I sat outside the tent for a while, drinking a beer and listening to the nothing around me. Stayed calm for a long time. Around 10 o'clock, I decided to walk the edges of the graveyard and take a few pictures with my phone. The flash lit up the tombstones harshly, making long black shadows swing behind them. Most of the names were so worn down I couldn't even read them. I got a weird feeling a few times, like I was stepping on something important, but I kept going. It wasn't until I made it back to my tent that I noticed the first weird thing. My sleeping bag looked different, like it had been moved. It wasn't rolled out flat the way I left it. It was scrunched up toward the far side of the tent. I stood there for a second, shining my flashlight on it, feeling a slow trickle of unease start to build in my gut. Maybe the wind, I thought. Maybe the way I stomped the ground didn't pack it down enough and the bag slid a little. I knew it was a weak excuse, but I made myself believe it. I got inside the tent, fixed the bag, zipped the tent flap shut, and crawled in. I didn't sleep right away. I lay there, listening to the thin breath of the wind outside, the dry rattling of branches. Every now and then, I thought I heard something else, a soft, irregular sound. Not the steady noise of the wind, but something sharper. A footstep, a whisper. I didn't know. I told myself it was my mind playing tricks. In a place like that, with all the heavy darkness pressing down, your brain looks for patterns that aren't there. You hear one scrape of a branch, and suddenly it becomes a foot dragging in the dirt. Eventually, I must have drifted off. I woke up to the sound of something brushing against the side of the tent. It wasn't hard or heavy, just a faint scritch, like fingers dragging lightly across the canvas. My heart jumped into my throat. I froze, every muscle tight, listening. The noise came again. Screech. Then a pause. Then a heavier sound, like something tapping the side of the tent once, twice. I slid my hand toward the flashlight and clicked it on, aiming it at the side of the tent. Nothing. Just the greenish fabric bulging slightly where the breeze pushed against it. I waited, listened. The wind picked up for a second, fluttering the tent walls. Nothing unusual. I told myself it was a branch, maybe, or an animal, a raccoon or a stray dog. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had brushed the tent wasn't an accident. It had felt deliberate, like someone testing the fabric. I unzipped the flap and poked my head out, sweeping the flashlight around. The beam caught on tombstones, the broken trunk of a fallen tree, the dark emptiness beyond. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. I stayed like that for a long time, light in one hand, pistol in the other, my heart pounding so hard I felt dizzy. Finally, I pulled back inside, zipped the flap again, and sat there with the flashlight resting across my knees. I wasn't going to sleep anymore. That much was clear. Hours dragged by. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, the flashlight started to dim. Batteries dying. I switched to the headlamp, keeping it low to save power. That's when I heard it. A thump, soft but unmistakable, coming from behind the tent, near the oak tree. I killed the light immediately and held my breath. Another thump, closer. Something or someone was moving through the graveyard. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen. My mind raced through possibilities. A drunk? A hunter? Some other crazy loner like me? Maybe a homeless guy who used the graveyard as a place to sleep? Another step, crunch of dead grass underfoot. Then another, slow, steady, deliberate. It was coming toward my tent. I raised the pistol, the metal cold and heavy in my hand. I didn't want to fire it unless I had to. A .22 isn't a powerhouse, and if I missed, I might just make things worse. The steps stopped about 10 feet away. Silence. Then, very faintly, I heard breathing. I don't mean the whisper of the wind or the noise of animals. I mean real human breathing. Slow, shallow, raspy. I sat there sweating, trying to think, trying to plan. If they rushed the tent, I wouldn't have much time to react. The thin fabric wouldn't stop a knife or even hands. Minutes passed. Finally, the breathing faded. I didn't hear steps walking away, but somehow, it felt like whatever was out there had moved off. Maybe crouched down behind a headstone. Maybe watching. I stayed inside the tent until first light. I didn't even unzip the flap. Just sat there, my legs cramping, my neck stiff, the gun never leaving my hand. When dawn finally broke, gray and cold and wet, I unzipped the tent and stumbled out. The graveyard looked normal again. Empty, still, but there were footprints, clear as day. Deep impressions in the soft ground around the oak tree. Not animal prints. Shoes, heavy, wide like work boots. They circled the tent. Twice. I followed them with my eyes, heart hammering. They didn't lead in from the trees. They didn't lead out. It was like whoever made them had just appeared in the middle of the graveyard, circled my tent, and disappeared. I packed up in a frenzy. Tent, bag, cooler, everything jammed into my pack any way it would fit. I didn't bother rolling anything up or cleaning the site. I just wanted to get out. As I stumbled back through the brush toward the truck, I kept looking over my shoulder. The graveyard stayed still and empty. When I reached the truck, I tossed everything into the bed and slammed the tailgate shut. I didn't even take a breath until I was halfway back down the dirt road, the tires sliding and bouncing over the ruts. I didn't tell anybody what happened. Who would believe me? No ghosts, no monsters, just some man, out there in the dark, watching. I didn't know what he wanted. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. I never went back to New Hope Cemetery. A few weeks later, I tried to find out more about it. I dug through old county records, newspaper archives. Nothing. The graveyard wasn't even listed anymore. But I found one thing. An old article from 1952 about a man found dead near the graveyard. No foul play suspected, the article said, but the details were strange. His pockets were turned inside out, his shoes missing, and he had been found with a look of pure terror on his face. I went camping alone in the summer of 2017, out in a less popular part of Utah, close to the Nevada border. I was 28 years old back then, working a desk job I hated in Salt Lake City. It was one of those stretches where I felt like if I didn't get away for a while, I was going to lose my mind. I didn't want to go to a crowded national park full of people with fancy gear and cameras, so I picked a patch of Bureau of Land Management land I found online. It didn't have any official campsites, just raw land. Miles and miles of open scrub and low, rocky hills. Exactly what I needed. I packed my old Ford Ranger with basic supplies. A small tent, a cooler full of food, 2 gallons of water, a sleeping bag, a basic first aid kit, a knife, a flashlight, a couple of extra batteries, and a few other things. I brought my old .22 rifle too, more out of habit than real concern. I wasn't expecting trouble out there, but I always liked having it nearby when I camped alone. The drive out was quiet. Once I got off the paved highways, the roads turned to rough, narrow dirt tracks, winding through low hills and broken desert. Every so often, I'd pass an old rusted fence or a gate leading nowhere, half swallowed by sand and weeds. The air was dry and sharp, smelling like dust and creosote. No clouds, just a wide, hard blue sky pressing down on everything. I drove maybe 40 miles into nowhere before I found a spot that felt right. It was tucked up against the base of a rocky outcrop, with a few scraggly junipers offering a bit of shade. I pulled the truck off the track and set up camp behind a small rise, where I wouldn't be easily seen from the road, not that anyone was likely to come by. By late afternoon, I had the tent set up, a small fire pit built, and a rough seat made out of some flat stones. I cracked open a beer from the cooler, sat back, and listened to the silence. It wasn't the complete silence you get in a soundproof room. It was alive, full of small noises. The whisper of wind through dry grass, the occasional click of insects, a distant bird call, sharp and lonely. After a few hours, the sun started to sag toward the horizon, painting everything in long shadows and deep gold. I ate a simple dinner, cold sandwiches and some chips, and watched the sky catch fire. When the stars came out, they came out hard and fast. I hadn't seen a sky like that in years. The Milky Way was a thick, glowing river overhead. I lay on my sleeping bag outside the tent for a long time, just staring up, feeling small in the best possible way. Around midnight, I packed up my trash, put the cooler back in the truck, and crawled into my tent. I left the rain fly off so I could still see the stars. It was a warm night. I didn't bother with the sleeping bag, just laid on top of it, feeling the dry air move over my skin. Somewhere deep in the night, I woke up with a strange feeling. Nothing dramatic, just a prickling at the back of my neck. The kind of thing that drags you out of a dead sleep without any obvious reason. I listened hard. At first, I heard nothing but the same soft sounds. Wind, insects, the creak of dry wood. But after a few minutes, I caught something different. Faint crunch, then another. Footsteps. I lay completely still, heart starting to hammer against my ribs. I told myself it could be an animal, a coyote maybe, or a deer, but it didn't sound right. Too heavy, too slow and deliberate. Not the fast, skittish steps of a wild animal. I slowly reached over and grabbed the flashlight and the rifle. I didn't turn the light on. Instead, I just waited, ears straining. The steps moved closer, then stopped. I stayed frozen for what felt like an hour. Nothing happened. Eventually, I convinced myself I had imagined it, or maybe it had been a harmless animal after all. I stayed awake until the sky started to pale, then finally dozed off again, the rifle clutched against my chest. The next morning, I stepped carefully around my camp, looking for tracks. The ground was hard and rocky, not good for prints, but near the edge of the little clearing, I found something. A scuffed boot mark, right where the sand was soft enough to hold it. Human, too big to be mine. I I stood there for a long time, feeling a pit open in my gut. I hadn't seen another soul for miles. Whoever it was had come close enough to my tent to leave a footprint, then backed off. Why? Why hadn't they just said something if they meant no harm? I thought about packing up right then, but stubbornness kept me there. I had driven a long way to get some peace, and I wasn't going to let one weird night scare me off. I spent the day hiking around the hills, keeping my rifle slung across my back. I didn't go far, never out of sight of my camp. Every now and then, I'd catch myself looking over my shoulder, sure I was being watched. But the hills stayed empty, hot and silent. When night fell again, I built my fire bigger than usual. I figured light and noise might keep anything or anyone away. I sat up late, drinking coffee and feeding the fire. When I finally crawled into the tent, I left the rifle right next to me. This time, sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the tent fabric, every shift of the wind set my nerves on edge. It was maybe 2 a.m. when I heard it again. Not footsteps this time, something softer, like the whisper of fabric against fabric. I lay there, muscles locked, listening. Then, from outside the tent, the faintest scrape of something against the nylon. I sat up slowly, barely breathing. Whatever it was, they were right outside. I flicked on the flashlight and jammed it against the tent wall, illuminating the fabric from inside. For a split second, I saw a shape, a person crouched low. They bolted the second the light hit them. I heard their footsteps hammering away across the rocks. I unzipped the tent and staggered out, heart slamming against my ribs, the flashlight beam jerking wildly across the darkness. I didn't see anyone, just empty hills and night. I didn't sleep again after that. I packed up camp while it was still dark, stuffing everything into the truck in a blind rush. I didn't even bother folding the tent properly, just jammed it into the back seat. By the time the first gray light touched the horizon, I was already driving back the way I had come, bouncing hard over the ruts and rocks. After maybe 20 minutes of driving, I saw something that made my blood turn cold. A second set of tire tracks. Not mine. They were fresher than the ones I had made coming in. At some point during the night, someone else had driven up that same dirt track, heading toward my camp. I floored the gas pedal and didn't let up until I hit the paved highway again. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I didn't even relax until I was deep into the city, lost in the safety of traffic and noise. When I got home, I unpacked half-heartedly, dropping my gear in a heap by the door. It was only when I pulled out the tent that I noticed something else. A long, shallow slice had been cut into the side of the tent. Not a tear from rocks or branches, a clean cut, like from a knife. I stared at it for a long time, heart pounding all over again. Whoever had been out there hadn't just stumbled across my camp. They had been watching, sneaking close enough to touch the tent, close enough to cut it, and they hadn't said a word. I never reported it. What could I say? There wasn't any real evidence, and I hadn't actually seen the person's face. Just a crouched shadow and a footprint in the sand. But after that, I didn't camp alone anymore. Not because of ghosts or monsters, because of people. Because sometimes the scariest thing out there isn't some story you tell around a fire. It's the person who doesn't make a sound, who waits, who watches, and for reasons you'll never know, chooses not to leave you alone. I was 27 the summer I decided to take some time off work and travel through South America. I had saved up for years, picking up random jobs, eating cheap food, and living in small apartments just to have enough to explore places I had only seen on old maps and travel magazines. I picked Colombia, mainly because it was cheap, warm, and full of mountains and forests that still felt wild. I liked being alone, and I didn't mind roughing it if it meant I could wake up somewhere most people had never heard of. It was July 2017 when I flew into Bogota. I spent a few days wandering the city, getting used to the noise, the smells, and the heavy air. After that, I took buses south into the mountains, sometimes hitchhiking with farmers who didn't speak any English. My Spanish was terrible, but I could point and smile enough to get by. By the second week, I found myself deep in the hills near a small town called San Vicente. I had heard from a few backpackers that there were remote trails out there, ones that weren't even on maps, trails you could hike for days without seeing anyone. That was exactly what I wanted. I carried everything on my back: a small tent, a sleeping bag, a lightweight stove, a first aid kit, and about 4 days worth of food. Water I could get from streams if I boiled it. The first day into the hills was incredible. The air smelled like wet earth and flowers. Birds I didn't recognize called out from the trees. In the distance, dark green mountains layered into the mist like folds of a blanket. I followed an old mule trail that wound up the side of a valley, cutting across streams and fields where cows grazed. I hiked until late afternoon before finding a spot under some thick trees, flat enough for my tent. I set up camp, boiled some water for instant noodles, and sat back against my backpack to watch the sunset stain the clouds orange and pink. That night, the forest was noisy with insects and night birds, but it didn't bother me. I fell asleep fast, feeling like I was exactly where I wanted to be. The second day, I kept going deeper. The trail got harder to follow, more overgrown. Sometimes it split off into smaller paths, but I stuck to the ones that looked the most used. Midway through the afternoon, it started raining. A heavy, soaking rain that came fast out of the hot sky. I pulled on a cheap poncho, but it didn't help much. The trail turned to mud, and my boots sucked down into it with every step. I didn't see anyone all day. No houses, no fences, no dogs barking in the distance. Just endless hills and trees and fog rolling over the ground like smoke. That night, I found a clearing that looked safe enough. I set up my tent again, peeled off my wet clothes, and crawled into my sleeping bag, shivering a little even though it was still warm outside. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of branches snapping nearby. I lay there completely still, breathing as quietly as I could. It wasn't an animal moving. It was the careful, slow sound of someone stepping through the brush. A two-legged shuffle, not the quick, darting noise deer or pigs make. I reached out slowly and gripped the handle of my knife, which I kept by the sleeping bag just in case. I stayed like that, frozen, for what felt like an hour. Eventually, the noise faded away. I told myself it had just been a cow wandering by. There were cows everywhere around here. I must have scared it off. Still, it took a long time to fall back asleep after that. The next morning, I packed up fast and moved on. I kept telling myself it had been nothing, but I still kept looking over my shoulder more than usual. By late afternoon, the trail had basically disappeared. I figured I must have wandered off it without realizing. I pulled out my map, but it was useless now. I had no signal on my phone, not even a bar. I wasn't too worried though. I had my compass, and I knew that if I kept heading west, eventually I'd hit the river valley where there were more farms and maybe a road. That third night, I camped by a little stream. I set up my tent farther from the water than usual because I didn't want animals coming to drink and stumbling over me in the dark. I built a small fire just to keep my spirits up, even though it wasn't really cold. I sat there watching the flames flicker, eating cold tuna from a can, feeling more tired than I should have. That night, I had a dream about someone standing outside my tent, pulling at the corners of it gently, almost testing it. When I woke up, the tent was still standing, but I found a single muddy handprint smeared low on the fabric near where my head had been. My stomach dropped when I saw it. The handprint was small, not much bigger than my own, but definitely human. I stared at it for a long time. I hadn't heard anything. I hadn't seen anything. But someone had been close enough to touch my tent while I was asleep inside. I packed up in record time and started moving. I didn't even eat breakfast. My whole body felt wired, like every muscle was buzzing. The trail, if you could even call it that anymore, was just patches of flattened grass and animal tracks. The trees were thick and the ground climbed steeply uphill. My legs burned with the effort, but I didn't stop. I just wanted to get back to somewhere with people. Around noon, it started raining again, this time even harder than before. The water came down in sheets, soaking through my clothes, my backpack, even the supposed waterproof case around my map. The ground turned into a slick mess of mud and rocks. I slipped and fell hard once, sliding a few feet downhill and banging my knee against a stone. I sat there in the mud for a few minutes, holding my leg and feeling like a complete idiot. I couldn't tell if the knee was badly hurt, but it hurt enough to make walking slower and harder. Still, I kept going. I limped forward, following the pull of the slope downward, thinking it would lead to a river or a farm or anything. Late that afternoon, through the thick gray rain, I spotted something that looked like a shack or an old hut. It was made of wood, with a sagging tin roof and walls that leaned inward like they were tired of standing. It didn't look lived in. No smoke, no signs of recent work. I hesitated for a long time before heading toward it. If someone was there, they might not be friendly. On the other hand, it was shelter, and I didn't want to sleep another night out in the open with whoever was creeping around these hills. The door was hanging open, swinging slightly in the wind. I stepped inside slowly, knife still gripped tight in my hand. The shack was empty except for an old wooden table and a couple of broken chairs. The floor was dirt. One corner was blackened from an old fire. There was a pile of junk in the corner, broken tools, rusted cans, and an old tarp. I checked the whole place carefully, even tapping on the walls to make sure no one was hiding. It was clear. I pulled the door shut and wedged a stick under it to keep it closed. It wasn't much, but it made me feel a little better. I set up my sleeping bag in the cleanest spot I could find and peeled off my wet clothes, hanging them over the broken chairs in a pathetic attempt to dry them. That night, the rain hammered on the tin roof like gunshots. I lay there in the dark, knife still in my hand, listening to the storm and every tiny creak the shack made. At some point, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps outside, slow, steady steps, crunching the wet ground. I held my breath, heart racing so loud I could feel it in my ears. The steps circled the shack, once, twice, then stopped by the door. I heard the door creak as someone pushed against it gently. It didn't open, the stick held. The pushing stopped. A few minutes later, the steps moved away, fading into the rain. I didn't sleep at all after that. I just lay there staring into the darkness, knife clutched so tight my hand hurt. When the sun finally rose, the rain had stopped. I packed up and got out of there as fast as my bad knee would allow. Every few minutes I would stop and listen, heart hammering, sure I would hear footsteps again. By midday, I finally stumbled onto a real trail, a wide dirt road, rutted by old tire tracks but definitely used. I almost cried when I saw it. I followed it west for hours, ignoring the ache in my leg and the blisters on my feet. I didn't stop for anything. Around late afternoon, I saw a small house ahead, perched on the edge of a hill. It was simple, white walls, red roof, chickens running around out front. Smoke curled from a chimney. I limped up to it, waving both arms to make sure they saw I wasn't a threat. An older man came out, wary at first, but when he saw the state I was in, muddy, soaked, limping, he called out something in Spanish and waved me inside. I collapsed into a chair by the fire they had going. The man and his wife brought me food, rice and beans and eggs, and talked at me kindly, even though I barely understood. I just kept nodding, grateful beyond words. The next morning, they helped arrange a ride back to the town. From there, I caught a bus north to Bogota. I didn't camp again for the rest of that trip. I stuck to hostels and cheap hotels, always making sure there were locks on the doors and people nearby. I never found out who was in those woods with me. Maybe it was some local trying to scare off outsiders. Maybe it was someone desperate, living rough in the hills, stealing what they could. Maybe it was worse. It didn't matter. I made My name's Aaron Ellis, and this all happened back in late October 2019. I was 26 years old then, living alone in a small town called Verona, just outside of Flagstaff, Arizona. My grandfather, Walter Ellis, had passed away that summer. He was 78. He and I were real close, closer than I was with my own dad, if I'm being honest. Grandpa was a big part of my life growing up. He was a retired sheriff, the old school type, tough but fair, the kind of man that didn't say much, but you could tell he meant everything he did say. After he passed, it was like there was this big hole in my life that I couldn't fill no matter what I did. Around mid-October, I started getting these restless nights. I would stay up too late, scrolling through my phone, not really paying attention to anything, just trying to fill the silence. I kept thinking about how Grandpa and I used to go camping out in Coconino National Forest when I was a kid. He taught me how to start a fire with wet wood, how to find true north without a compass, how to listen to the woods and notice when something felt off. I hadn't been camping in years, not real camping anyway. Not the way Grandpa taught me. One night, after another evening of just sitting around doing nothing, I decided I needed to get out. I packed up some gear from the garage, an old Coleman tent, my sleeping bag, a small propane stove, a hatchet, a hunting knife, a flashlight with backup batteries, a first aid kit, 2 gallons of water, and a week's worth of beef jerky and trail mix. I threw it all into the back of my beat-up 2006 Tacoma and decided I was going to spend a few days out in the forest, alone, the way Grandpa would have wanted it. I thought maybe it would help clear my head. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I didn't post about it online. I just loaded up and drove out early one morning. I headed north, off the main highway, onto a maze of old forestry roads that twisted and turned through miles and miles of pines and junipers. I wanted to find somewhere really remote, not one of those crowded campgrounds with paved loops and RV hookups, but a spot way off the beaten path where I wouldn't hear another human voice for days. After about 3 hours of driving, I found a place. It was a narrow clearing surrounded by thick trees, about half a mile from a little seasonal creek that probably dried up in the summer but still had a trickle running through it in October. There were no tire tracks, no fire pits, no signs anyone had camped there in a long time. Felt right. I set up camp under a big old ponderosa pine, the kind that smells like vanilla when the sun heats it up. I pitched my tent facing east so I could see the sunrise through the trees. I gathered some dead wood and built a fire ring out of rocks. It took a while to get everything set up, and by the time I was done, the sun was already starting to dip low in the sky. That first night was quiet. Too quiet, almost. I made a small fire, cooked up some kin soup, and sat staring into the flames, feeling more alone than I had in a long time. I missed Grandpa something fierce. I kept remembering how he used to sit by the fire, whittling sticks with his pocket knife, telling me to pay attention to the way the woods sounded at night. He said you could tell a lot from the sounds. If the crickets suddenly stopped chirping, or if the frogs went silent, you needed to pay attention because something might be out there. I didn't hear any crickets that night. No frogs either. Just the wind moving through the trees, a low whooshing sound that never really stopped. Once or twice, I thought I heard something moving through the underbrush, but it was probably just a rabbit or a raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to tell myself it was just my nerves, just being alone in the woods after so long. Eventually, I doused the fire, climbed into my sleeping bag, and tried to sleep. Sleep didn't come easy. Every little crack or snap from outside made my heart jump. Around midnight, I thought I heard footsteps. Not animal footsteps, but something heavier. Something that moved with a rhythm, 2 steps, pause, 2 steps, pause, like a person walking slowly through the trees. I held my breath, listening hard, but after a minute it stopped. I told myself it had to be the wind knocking branches around. Maybe a deer, maybe an elk. Arizona has plenty of both. I finally drifted off sometime around 3 in the morning. The next morning, I woke up to frost on the ground and my breath puffing out in little clouds. It was colder than I expected. I made a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee, trying to shake off the bad feeling from the night before. After breakfast, I decided to do some exploring. I strapped on my boots, grabbed my knife and water bottle, and headed east, toward the creek. The woods were beautiful in the morning light. The sun filtered down through the tall pines, making the air glow golden. I walked along the creek, hopping from rock to rock, following the water upstream. About half a mile up, I found something odd. There was an old hunting blind built up between 2 trees, camouflaged with branches and leaves. It looked abandoned. The wood was weathered gray, and some of the brush had fallen off. But it didn't look that old. Maybe a few months, maybe less. I climbed up to take a look, but there was nothing inside except an old empty thermos and a shredded tarp. I kept moving upstream. Around noon, I found another strange thing. It was a tree, a big oak that had been stripped of all its bark on one side, from about waist height up to 7 or 8 feet. The bark was just gone. like something had scraped it clean. I ran my hand over the exposed wood. It was rough and splintery. I didn't know what could have done that. Bears sometimes mark trees, but the marks are usually clawed and rough. This was different, more like a long, clean scraping. I didn't like it, but I wasn't ready to pack up and leave just yet. I made my way back to camp slowly, stopping every few minutes to listen. The woods were still too quiet. It felt like the whole forest was holding its breath. That afternoon, the clouds started rolling in. Thick, heavy gray clouds that blocked out the sun and made the woods feel even darker. I decided to gather a bunch of firewood before the rain hit. I wanted a big fire going that night. I spent 2 hours gathering dry sticks and branches and stacking them under a tarp near the fire ring. By the time I was done, the first fat raindrops had started to fall. The rain came in hard and cold, a real mountain storm. I hunkered down in my tent, reading an old paperback novel by flashlight, trying to ignore the way the wind made the trees creak and groan. The rain slapped against the nylon walls of the tent, a steady drumming that made it hard to hear anything else. I must have fallen asleep for a while because when I woke up, it was dark and the rain had stopped. Everything was wet and cold, and the firewood was damp even under the tarp. I managed to get a small fire going anyway, using some birch bark and the driest sticks I could find. I sat close to the flames, warming my hands, feeling like the woods were closing in around me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there at the edge of the firelight. I didn't, but that didn't make me feel any better. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time they were closer, slow, deliberate, crunching wet leaves underfoot. My heart slammed against my ribs. I killed the fire as fast as I could, throwing dirt and wet leaves over it, plunging the camp into darkness. I crouched low, listening. The steps kept coming, closer, then they stopped. I stayed crouched there for what felt like an hour, straining my ears, holding my breath. Nothing, no more steps, no sounds at all except the distant drip of water from the trees. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and kept my knife clutched in my hand. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I found tracks, big tracks, boot prints deep in the mud, leading from the trees right up to where my fire had been, and then around my tent. They circled my tent, once, twice, then back into the woods. I stood there staring at them for a long time. They weren't my prints. They were bigger and the tread was different. I checked around camp, nothing missing, nothing disturbed. But someone had been here, watching me, walking around my tent while I was inside. I packed up fast. I threw everything into the truck without caring how it was organized. I just wanted to get out. As I was about to drive off, I noticed something on the edge of the clearing, a small pile of rocks stacked neatly. It hadn't been there before. 3 stones balanced carefully on top of each other. A sign, a warning. I didn't know. I didn't stick around to find out. I drove back down the forestry roads faster than I should have, tires slipping on the wet dirt, heart hammering in my chest. I didn't feel safe until I saw the blacktop of the highway again. Even then, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following me. When I finally got home, it was late afternoon. I locked all the doors, pulled the blinds, and sat on the couch staring at the wall. I didn't sleep that night or the next. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those boot prints circling my tent. I never went back to that part of the forest. I never even told anyone about what happened. Part of me felt like it was my fault, like I had gone looking for something out there and found it. It was the summer of 2021 when I decided to take a week off from everything. I was 30 years old, living in a city that always seemed to move too fast. I had been feeling restless for months, dealing with long work hours and a growing sense of disconnect. So, I thought a solo camping trip would be the perfect way to clear my head. I chose the Klamath National Forest in Northern California, a place I'd only read about online. The forest was vast, remote, and relatively untouched, with rugged terrain and few tourists. I wasn't looking for a popular campground with amenities. This trip was about being alone, immersed in nature, away from the hum of everyday life. I packed my gear the night before: a tent, sleeping bag, stove, a cooler with food, a first aid kit, a flashlight, a small axe, and plenty of water. I didn't want to overdo it, but I made sure I had the essentials. I loaded it all into my Jeep early in the morning, the sun barely up, and hit the road. The drive took me through winding mountain roads, past small towns, and eventually to a dirt path leading deeper into the forest. By the time I arrived at the site, it was late afternoon. The place was quiet, the air cool, and the shadows from the trees stretched long across the forest floor. I found a secluded clearing by a small creek, far from any marked trail. It was exactly what I had hoped for, a peaceful spot where I could just disappear for a while. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and made a small campfire. As I cooked my first meal, I felt a sense of relief, like the weight of the city had lifted off my shoulders. The fire crackled, and the smell of cooking food mixed with the fresh forest scent. It was perfect. That night, the sky was clear, and the stars were bright. I sat by the fire, letting the warmth seep into my bones, listening to the sounds of the forest. I heard the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, and the distant gurgling of the creek. It was the kind of peace I had been craving. I went to bed early, exhausted from the drive and the setup. The air was cool inside the tent, and I fell asleep quickly. But around midnight, I woke up suddenly. It wasn't any noise that had stirred me, just a deep, unsettling feeling. I lay there in the dark, trying to shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I brushed it off. Maybe it was just the isolation, or my mind playing tricks on me. But then I heard it, a faint sound coming from outside the tent. A twig snapping, followed by the soft crunch of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, like someone walking just outside the reach of my campfire's light. My heart started to race. I knew I was in a remote area, and it was possible someone else was out there, though unlikely. I had checked the map. There were no marked trails nearby, and the nearest campground was miles away. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The footsteps stopped. For a few long seconds, everything was still. I held my breath, straining to hear any movement. Nothing. Then the sound came again, closer this time, like whoever it was had circled around my camp and was now right outside my tent. I froze, my mind racing. Was it an animal? Maybe a deer? No, this was different. These footsteps were too deliberate, too human. I reached for the small flashlight beside me, my hand trembling. Slowly, I turned it on and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The beam of light flicked across the clearing, illuminating nothing but trees and shadows. No one was there. I exhaled, feeling foolish. It was probably just an animal after all. But then the footsteps started again, this time directly outside my tent. My blood ran cold. Whoever it was, they were moving deliberately, as though they knew I was inside. I didn't dare make a sound. I waited in that tense silence, the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. It felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps stopped. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, wide-eyed and listening, but nothing else happened. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I decided I'd had enough. I packed up quickly, the unease in my chest growing with each movement. I didn't want to stay there any longer, not with the memory of those footsteps lingering in my mind. As I drove back toward the main road, I couldn't help but glance nervously in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was nothing. The forest was still and empty, just as it should be. It wasn't until I got back home and did some research that I learned something that made my skin crawl. The area I had camped in, though beautiful, had a dark history. Several years earlier, a man had gone missing in the forest, his campsite abandoned but his belongings left behind. His disappearance was never solved, and to this day, there were whispers among locals about people who'd gone missing in the area, especially in the more remote sections of the forest. I never went back to that spot. I've camped in other places since then, but I always make sure there are other campers around. The forest is beautiful, but it can also be a place where things happen in the quiet, when no one is watching. And some of those things, well, they might not be so easily explained. The fear that gnawed at me on that night never fully went away. I think about it every time I go camping now, and I always double-check my surroundings, just in case. You never really know what's out there in the woods, and that's the scariest part of all. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to take a break from the noise of life and go camping alone in the English countryside. I was 29 back then, and life was just heavy. Work, bills, city noise, it never stopped. I needed something different. I needed quiet, something real. So I packed up my old Ford Fiesta with my cheap tent, sleeping bag, a few cans of beans, a little gas stove, a pocket knife, and a flashlight. I threw a waterproof jacket into the pile too, just in case. It was England after all. Rain could come any minute. I didn't plan much. I liked it that way. I drove from my flat in Nottingham out into the Peak District, figuring I'd find a quiet patch of land somewhere remote. I camped a few times before, but mostly with mates. This would be different, just me and the wild. No one telling me what to do, no deadlines, no noise except for the sounds of nature. I ended up parking near a place called Abney Moor. I'd never been there before. It was beautiful, rolling hills, thick patches of forest, the kind of lonely that I wanted. There wasn't a proper car park, just a muddy clearing off the side of a narrow road. It was about 6 in the evening when I arrived, the sky already turning that soft shade of gray that you only see before a rain. I got out, stretched my legs, and breathed deep. It smelled fresh. The air was cool, damp even before the rain started. I walked about 15 minutes off the road, into the scrubby brush, and found a decent spot to pitch my tent. It wasn't perfect. Ground was a little uneven, rocks poked out here and there, but it was hidden from the road, and that was what mattered. I didn't want some nosy dog walker stumbling onto me in the night. I set up my tent in a little dip between two hills. It offered some shelter from the wind at least. By the time I finished, the first drops started to fall. Light at first, barely there. I pulled my jacket tight and set up my little stove just outside the tent. I heated up a can of baked beans and ate straight out of it with a plastic spoon. It wasn't gourmet, but it was warm, and that was enough. The rain got heavier while I was eating, so I crawled into my tent, zipped it tight, and sat back against my rolled-up clothes that I was using as a pillow. I listened to the rain drumming harder and harder against the thin fabric. It was cozy in a weird way. I checked my phone, no signal, of course. I expected that. I turned it off to save the battery and tucked it into my backpack. It must have been around 9 when the light really faded. The rain was steady by then, cold and persistent, not the kind that clears up after a few minutes. I lay back, listening to it, breathing in the damp air, trying to relax. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I woke up with a start. The rain hadn't stopped. In fact, it sounded heavier, almost like a small stream pouring onto the tent. I looked around, disoriented, feeling the dark press against me. My flashlight was right by my head. I grabbed it but didn't turn it on yet. I listened first. There was something else, a sound. It wasn't the rain. It was faint, but it was there. Something shuffling in the wet grass. Something moving slowly, dragging maybe. My heart started hammering in my chest. I lay frozen, trying not to even breathe too loud. The sound wasn't right against the tent, but it wasn't far either. It moved past, slow and heavy. I told myself it was a deer, maybe a badger, some animal just trying to get out of the weather. But something deep in my gut said no. It wasn't the sound of small paws or hooves. It was slower, clumsier, like a person stumbling around. Minutes passed, or maybe it was just seconds. Time felt strange. I didn't hear it anymore, just the rain. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I turned on the flashlight, keeping it low, lighting up just the inside of the tent. I didn't want to give away my position. I lay there, wide awake now, ears straining, muscles tense. I thought about leaving, packing up and hiking back to the car. But the thought of walking through the dark, rainy hills with God knows what out there made my skin crawl even worse. I stayed. The hours dragged. Every so often, I thought I heard something, a stick cracking, wet grass brushing, but it was impossible to tell if it was real or just my mind playing tricks. At some point, maybe 3 in the morning, I decided I needed to piss. Badly. I didn't want to go out, but it was getting painful. I unzipped the tent slowly, every muscle screaming that it was a bad idea, and poked my head out. The rain was lighter now, just a fine mist. The world outside was a blur of shadows and shifting gray. I shone my flashlight in a small circle around me. Nothing. No movement. No sounds but the rain dripping from the grass. I stepped out, boots squelching into the soaked ground. I didn't wander far, just behind the tent. I kept one hand on the canvas like a lifeline. I finished quick and zipped back inside fast. I laid back down, soaked to the knees but relieved. I must have slept again, because the next thing I remember was waking to a faint scratching sound. Different from before. This was right up close, right against the side of the tent. I froze. The scratching was soft, like fingers brushing against the fabric. Testing it, feeling it. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stared at the dark ceiling, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. The scratching moved along the side, slow, deliberate. I gripped the flashlight so tight my knuckles hurt, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't dare. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. Silence. Nothing but rain again. I lay there until dawn. When the first gray light started leaking through the thin material of the tent, I finally moved. I waited another 10 minutes, listening, before I unzipped the flap and looked out. The world was wet and cold, mist curling over the hills. I stepped out carefully, scanning around with my flashlight, even though it was light enough to see a little. And then I saw them. Footprints, not animal prints, human ones, barefoot, in the cold, wet mud. They circled the tent. Twice, my stomach turned over. Whoever it was had been out here in the freezing rain with no shoes, walking around my tent, watching, listening. I packed up fast. I didn't even bother rolling the tent properly. I just stuffed it into the bag, grabbed my things, and sprinted towards the car, slipping and sliding in the mud. The walk back felt like a lifetime. Every shadow, every flicker of movement in the corner of my eye made my skin crawl. But I didn't see anyone, just empty hills and mist. When I finally reached my car, I almost cried. I threw everything into the back seat, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I sat there for a moment, soaked and shivering, hands trembling on the steering wheel. I started the engine and pulled out onto the road without even checking the mirror. I just wanted out. As I drove back toward Nottingham, I kept thinking about the footprints, the way they circled my tent, the way the scratching had moved so slowly along the fabric. I don't know who it was. Some drifter? A local farmer messing with campers? Someone looking to rob me? Or something worse? I never found out. I never went camping alone again after that. Even now, years later, whenever it rains at night, I sometimes wake up to the sound of it tapping against the window, and for a split second, I'm back there, lying in the cold, wet dark, listening to something moving outside my tent. But I'm safe now, home, and I'm never, ever going back out there alone.